Jelena, would you believe it if I told you that not everyone is sure they want to take the LSAT?
What? No way. It has logic games on it.
In fact, some people might think the GRE is an even better option as standardized assessments go.
Boo! Wait, why are you telling me this on our LSAT podcast? We both love the LSAT.
Well, because it's time to share with our listeners part one of our collaboration with Admissions Straight Talk podcast. Today, they're putting us in the hot seat and asking us all their listeners' questions about the LSAT.
Oh, and let me guess, one of those questions is, can I just take the GRE instead?
Yeah, basically.
Well, the sooner we get this episode rolling, the sooner we can convince everyone that the LSAT is awesome.
I don't know if we'll accomplish that in one episode, but I really do appreciate your enthusiasm.
Welcome to The Legal Level, a podcast from LSATMax. I'm Jelena.
And I'm Branden. We're your companions on the road to the legal field, whether you've just started thinking about law school or you've already passed the bar.
What are you, a lawyer?
The Legal Level is available from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and wherever you're listening to it right now.
If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to subscribe and tell a friend.
And as always, if you have questions about this episode, you can talk to a 99th percentile LSAT instructor by texting LSAT to 310-818-7743.
Or, if you'd like your question to be on the show, just email podcast@testmaxprep.com and we might answer you on the air.
Welcome to part one of our two-part collaboration with the Admissions Straight Talk podcast. Today, we're answering questions from Linda Abraham, founder of Accepted.com and host of the Admissions Straight Talk podcast.
Also joining us is Christine Carr, former Associate Director of Admissions for the Boston University School of Law. We'll hear more from her in part two, but today's all about the LSAT.
This collaboration is being published to both podcasts' feeds, so that's why you'll hear Branden and I introduce ourselves. If you've been listening to The Legal Level, you already know our LSAT stories and how we ended up at LSATMax, but Admissions Straight Talk listeners might not.
Let's get this two-part, two-podcast show on the road.
First of all, welcome Branden, Jelena, and Christine.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Pleasure to have you all. Okay, so my first questions for Jelena and Branden are, how did you both get involved with LSAT Prep? Jelena, why don't you start?
Sure, yeah. So the LSAT was kind of intended to be an off-ramp out of a tech career for me. I had thought about it for a number of years. In fact, recently I went back into an old email that I no longer have and realized I'd been talking about taking the LSAT in my emails years ago, way earlier than I ever thought that I was interested in it, with, some random guy from OkCupid that I was emailing back and forth with. But in 2017, I was tired of working in startups and thought about, maybe I should finally go ahead and take the LSAT. And to my surprise, I actually really, really enjoyed the LSAT. I got a 178 on the June 2017 test. And the process of studying for it actually taught me a lot that I had not picked up earlier in my life about study skills, my own learning style. And I ended up just liking the LSAT so much that I couldn't really quite figure out what I would do as a lawyer. So I never went to law school, but I just started teaching the LSAT and I'm still really loving it. So that's my journey. How about you, Branden?
Yeah, so my journey started earlier, as my life started much earlier because I'm much older. I studied for the LSAT first in the early 2000s. I ended up going to law school in 2007. I taught LSAT a little bit before I went to law school. And LSAT was always up my alley because I was a philosophy major as an undergrad. And I was really into symbolic logic. I took a lot of symbolic logic classes. And so when I studied for the LSAT, it was actually kind of close to what I had been doing as an undergrad, which is not the same for just about anybody who has any other degree. And then I went to law school. I practiced law for a few years. I had a kid and a wife at one point, and then my wife and I split up, and I had my daughter half the time, and working in the law firm was just not a flexible way for me to manage my responsibilities as a newfound single parent. And so doing LSAT prep was something that I had done before and I had loved, and it also gave me the flexibility. So I came back to it, and that was 8 years ago at this point. And so I've been doing it pretty much straight ever since. And I love the LSAT. I know that makes me weird, but to me, it's fun. Not just the logic games are fun, but I mean, I think the exam is fun. And I also really love teaching, and I love getting to interact with students. So it's definitely fit into my life as my life has changed. And so it's been great for me, and I really love it.
That's great. I'm wondering how many listeners or watchers are kind of wanting to throw something at both of you at the moment. I'm also wondering, I also once thought of going to law school, though I never got into the LSAT. Christine, are you also somebody who's considered law, or did you ever consider law?
It was the briefest blip on my in my memory. It was very short-lived right after graduating from undergrad.
Really?
Yeah.
No, I thought about it very seriously, I think, from freshman to junior year. Somewhere in my junior year, I said, I don't really want to do this. And ended up not knowing what I wanted to do when I graduated, but I figured it out at some point. Now, one of the questions that we frequently get is, should someone go to law school in a recession? Branden, you started UCLA Law, I think, in 2007, right?
Yes, I did.
And when the future looked very rosy for future lawyers. And you graduated in 2010 when the law school job market was the pits. Now,
I did.
You're
Yes.
not working as a lawyer today. How did you navigate that? And do you regret having gone to law school?
I do not regret having gone to law school. I will be paying law school debt for a while, but that said, I really enjoyed my time there, and I still find what I did there very useful. And so as far as going to law school during a recession, I think really that you shouldn't necessarily change your calculus because of a recession. And so I think a lot of people, at least, the students who came in a year or two after me, I started in 2007. Some of the students who came in 2008 and 2009 were seeking shelter from the storm. And I understand that, but I think the decision to practice law has to be one that is made on its own terms and not necessarily because you feel like you've, reached the end of other options. And so I think that going to law school in a recession is perfectly fine, but I think you have to have a better reason to do it than just because a recession has rolled around and you haven't thought of anything else that would be useful for you. So I think you have to just think about, what do I want my career to look like? Can I see a way that I will be happy and successful as an attorney? Then whether there's a recession on or not, if the answer to that question is yes, go to law school. If the answer to the question is no, then find something else to do with your time.
Absolutely. Now, LSATMax provides both GRE and LSAT Prep. And of course, one of the questions facing most law school applicants is, when should applicants take the LSAT and when should they take the GRE? Or who should take one and who should take the other? Jelena, do you have an answer for that one?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of top law schools that now will consider the GRE, but the LSAT is still the gold standard. So if really what you want is to go to law school and to attend a top law school, you need to be taking the LSAT. The GRE, the increasing acceptance of the GRE is largely intended to create more equitable access for students who maybe cannot afford either time-wise or expense-wise to prep for both, and who truly have not decided between grad school and law school. So if somebody is graduating from their undergrad, they want to go directly on to some form of continuing education and they really don't know which, and they really cannot afford to take and study for both tests, then the GRE is the only one that's applicable to both. You cannot use the LSAT for anything but law school, or maybe randomly impressing strangers if you get a good score. It doesn't get you into grad school. Although I have to say I've never significantly impressed someone in a bar with my LSAT score, so don't count on it getting you any dates. But really, you should, if you're considering law school, it's a huge time commitment, it's a huge investment, and it is a professional degree. It is intended for people who want to work in law. I still have a couple of years to potentially apply, and I haven't absolutely ruled it out, but there's a big reason that I haven't gone yet myself, is because if you're going to go to law school, you should be making that decision because you are very sure that you want to work as a lawyer. So if you're not sure and you're considering taking both, maybe just take the GRE, because if you're going to apply to law school, that should be a decision that you are making because you're certain. On the other hand, if you're certain about law school, take the LSAT, because the GRE is not going to open as many doors for you.
Okay. Branden, do you have anything to add to that?
Not other than to say that, and I think this makes Jelena's last point, which is that there are a limited number of schools that accept the GRE for a limited number of seats. And so if you want to apply broadly to law school, you have to take the LSAT.
Okay. And that's pretty unbiased because you sell both, so.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, right.
You're welcome to pay us for tutoring and prep for both, but you really probably shouldn't.
The switch first to the digital LSAT, which was a change that was planned for over time and very well thought out, and then to the Flex LSAT, which is remotely proctored and was created in response to COVID in a matter of weeks, changed test prep for the LSAT.
So the first one, the switch to the digital LSAT, as you mentioned, was planned out. I think the big change comes in the reading comprehension section, because the big change obviously is that you cannot write on the exam anymore. You get to use scratch paper, and for all of the sections of the exam, they also offer you the opportunity within the section to use 3 highlighter colors to highlight what you're reading, as well as an underline to underline what you're reading. That, I think, is sufficient for logical reasoning and for logic games, especially since you have the scratch paper. But for reading comprehension, it presents a big problem, because I know my methodology, and I think the methodology of most people before, was to have a system for tagging the passage, for tracking arguments in the passage. And so it really has changed the way that students approach reading comprehension, and I just don't see how it could not change that approach. As far as the change from having a digital LSAT to the LSAT-flex, which was created, as you mentioned, under basically emergency conditions.
Pandemic right here.
The substance of the exam is pretty much the same. So they changed from having 2 logical reasoning sections and 1 each of reading comp and logic games to having just 1 section of each that counts. So it's a smaller exam. It means logical reasoning is not as important as it was before. It used to be like the king of LSAT sections. Now it's just one among many. But as far as how you prep for the exam, I think it's pretty much the same. And so the interface is a little bit different. The in-person LSAT, once it went digital, was taken on a tablet that was provided at a testing center that you used a stylus with. Now the LSAT-flex you take on a laptop or a desktop computer at home. But what you are doing is pretty much the same. I think one of the things that's very important, the distinction between the LSAT in person and the LSAT-flex, is just the difference in testing conditions. And so depending upon what are your ideal testing conditions, I think you have to, practice as much as possible before you get to test day. The one other thing that is important, and that has been, I think LSAC has tried their best, or at least worked on it, which is pretty much anybody who can sign up for the LSAT can get themselves to a testing center. However, once the LSAT was a home-based exam, it became out of reach for a lot of people. There's a lot of people who cannot find a room that they can have to themselves silently for 3 hours. There's a lot of people who just don't have their own laptop or desktop computer that will work with the LSAT-flex. And so LSAC has been working with people, sometimes to get them hotel rooms to take the LSAT-flex in. They've been working with them to get them loaner computers. But I think more or less, especially if you're in that situation, I think you have to really start out early and work with LSAC to make sure that you have a testing situation that is going to work. But otherwise, the subject matter is the same. So I think your studies are pretty much the same.
Great advice. Jelena, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is to the question about the difference between this planned and premeditated transition and the emergency transition is, you're always, anytime there's a change, there's going to be a lot of stuff on the internet, especially on like the LSAT subreddit, on Quora, a lot about all of the issues. My proctor didn't understand the rules. My proctor's technology didn't work. My technology unexpectedly didn't work. Something was buggy. LSAC gave me an incorrect response to a question. But all of that stuff happened on the pencil and paper LSAT all the time too. So I always, just regardless of whether there's change happening, whether there's planned change happening, emergency change happening, or just the status quo, I always recommend that LSAT students be ready on testing day for all kinds of unexpected issues, and in fact, expect to have issues because they're very, very common. You're dealing with human beings proctoring your test, and human beings make human errors, and now we've got technology involved too, and technology makes technical errors. So, be ready for your test to take longer than you expected, be ready to have to wait for an issue to be resolved, and ideally be taking your test early enough that if something goes badly enough wrong that you need to retake, that it's not going to throw off your application plans.
Sounds good. Now, you mentioned that reading comprehension in terms of, I guess, prep for reading comprehension as well as actually taking the reading comprehension portion of the exam had to change because the rules changed. What changes do you recommend for that? How to adapt?
I mean, I would say that you should always, regardless of what format you're studying with, you should be studying in as close of conditions to the test conditions as possible. So as Branden said, now you've got your highlighters, you've got your underlining, and you've got scratch paper. So really be taking your practice tests, be doing your study, ideally on the device that you will use for the test, ideally in the room where you will be taking the test, and with whatever scratch paper or pen and pencil that you plan to use on the test. So you've got to learn what your system is, and maybe Branden can quickly explain what his system is for annotating reading comp in the new format without, getting us too far into the weeds of reading comprehension.
Okay.
But he does have a great system. But, really the important thing as far as prep is that you don't use an outdated form of prep. So there are books out there are blog posts and YouTube videos out there that teach reading comprehension annotation in a way that is designed still for the pencil and paper exam. So really the important thing is just to make sure that wherever you are learning your annotation system, wherever you're learning to do your reading comprehension work, you're learning it somewhere that is recently updated and that is talking about 3 highlighters and underlining, not talking about writing notes in the margins of your paper.
Okay. Branden, what do you want to add?
Well, so Jelena was mentioning my system, and I do have a system, and let me try to very briefly explain it, and it's not that complicated. But the idea with reading comprehension, or what you're being tested on, is your ability to read a judicial opinion, which will be the vast majority of your readings in law school. And so you have to understand that you're doing the analog of that. And in a judicial opinion, the judge, or more accurately speaking, the judge's clerk, will write out the arguments of plaintiff and defendant on a particular issue, will critique those arguments, and will decide usually who is right and who is wrong. And so you're doing the same thing, even if you're doing a science passage or some other non-law related passage, you're still engaged in that process. And so tracking the arguments is what's most important. An argument always has at least 2 pieces, which is a main conclusion, the thing the author is trying to prove to you, and at least one bit of evidence supporting that conclusion. And so in order to keep up with the tasks that I was talking about, I use the underline in order to underline the conclusions, because those are the most important argument. I use the yellow highlighter to highlight premises, to note where the support is. I use the pink highlighter to note criticisms and attitude, because like I said, the judge will critique the arguments, and that's very important. And then there are also some commonly tested details that I mark with the orange highlighters. You can use the highlighters for whatever you want, but I do think your main goal has to be tracking the different arguments, and the highlighters have to serve that purpose.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's very good. I hope listeners are taking notes.
I hope so.
Great suggestions. Now, and you can split this up as you want. The next question: what are your top tips for the current 3 sections of the LSAT: the reading comp, the analytical reasoning, and logical reasoning? So, Branden, you want to start with this one?
All right. Well, I'll leave games to Jelena, because she is the games maven and she knows more about that stuff than me. With logical, why don't we talk logical reasoning, because we've talked a little bit about reading comprehension.
Right.
Logical reasoning can be both easier and tougher in that each question is its own thing. They're not related to one another. And so you're getting basically 25 standalone questions. All of the sections of the LSAT are difficult to manage your time, because they give you 35 minutes for questions that are very difficult to complete in 35 minutes. And so my top tip for all of the sections, but I'll talk about how to apply it to logical reasoning, is about time management. And the basic idea, I think, in time management on the LSAT is this. Unless you demand a 180 on the exam, you are going to miss some questions. You can miss, on the LSAT-Flex, you can miss 7 or 8 questions and still score high 160s, low 170s. And so the plan that you should have for all the sections, and I'll talk about how it relates to logical reasoning, is to get to all the questions that you're going to get right and to spend time on them, and to not spend time on the questions that you're going to get wrong anyway. That calculus changes from student to student because each student has their own strengths and weaknesses. But I think there are a couple of tips for deciding whether or not a question is in your interest to do. There are a couple of question types that just take a long time. We call parallel questions and parallel flaw questions, ask you to analyze 6 arguments rather than 1. And those take a long time. So I usually tell my students to skip those and come back to them. Questions that require conditional diagramming. If your listeners have studied for the LSAT, they probably know what conditional diagramming is. That takes a lot of time. So I think those are questions that often should be skipped and come back to. Usually the way an LSAT section is structured is that the questions are more straightforward to begin with. They get harder as the section goes on, but the hardest ones are not at the end. Instead, the hardest questions on a logical reasoning section come around 18 through 22. And I usually tell my students to just skip those ones and do those last. And so all of those things, also, if you have subject matter blocks, or if there's a particular, if language difficulty is an issue for you, then you should skip the questions that are very worded in a difficult way or have difficult subject matter. And all of that is just putting the questions in the order that suits you rather than in the order that suits the makers of the LSAT.
Okay, great. Thank you. And let's see, what about the analytical reasoning or games? Jelena, I guess it's for you.
Yeah. And first of all, just to make sure that our listeners, watchers know, analytical reasoning and logic games are the same thing. Most people call it logic games. Analytical reasoning is what LSAC calls it because they're just kind of too pretentious to call anything on their test games. But it's a game. It's fun. So, I love logic games. I think it's really great that in the middle of this really difficult, potentially life-changing test, you get to spend 35 minutes doing something fun. So one of my logic games tips is learn to love them. Of course you're scared of them at the beginning because it's not something anybody knows how to do unless you're a philosophy major like Branden. You have never done anything like this before. If you are a philosophy major like Branden, you may have a leg up on the competition. But for the most part, this is a completely new skill to people. So don't let the fact that you blow your first logic games section on your first practice test make you hate them. Everybody blew. I got like 3 right on my first logic game section, literally. I tried to draw an Excel spreadsheet on my paper. I was making tables. I was not diagramming properly. I didn't know what diagramming a logic game was. I did horribly. And now I very, very rarely get a logic games question wrong, even on new logic games, even in a timed environment. It's totally possible to go from terrible at them to great at them. They're very learnable. They're the most learnable, I think, section of the LSAT. I think most people would agree that you can improve the most on logic games from your initial diagnostic to your actual test day. So they're a great opportunity to improve your score. So have a great attitude toward them, enjoy them, and put the time in. And while you're putting the time in, one of the most important things that you can do is repeat logic games. I actually have all of my own students do a set of the same 10 logic games at least 5 times. I have a set that I use for that are different types, that use different types of deductions, different types of diagramming, different scenarios, different questions. Because when you repeat logic games, it teaches you that there really are no new logic games. All of the new logic games on the LSAT are just recombinations of elements that have already been used. There have been so many tests that they're not going to come up with something that's brand new anymore. So you get to the point after you have done the same thing over and over that you realize that when you're faced with a game you haven't done before, you're still doing the same thing over and over. And you go, oh, well, this is about chefs putting ingredients into a vegetable soup, but this is actually kind of exactly like that game that I just did 5 times about people choosing offices in an office building. and I'm just going to diagram it the exact same way I did that one. And now it doesn't feel new and scary anymore. Now it's just like, okay, well, what are the new deductions in this game that are different from the chef's or different from the home office's game?
Okay, that's an interesting take on it. I actually have a son. He ended up not becoming a lawyer, but he loves logic games. And he, at one point, when he was thinking of law school, got an LSAT book and was just having fun with the logic game.
Oh yeah, I literally there's now there's talk of maybe removing logic games from the test in 4 years. There was a lawsuit, it was a whole thing. And I'm now convinced that what I need to do with my life is somehow buy the copyright to the logic games format from the LSAC if they actually do eliminate logic games, and just start publishing them like Sudoku as a thing that people can do for fun.
Yeah, all right. Okay. Now let's go back to the whole LSAT GRE question. In the business school world, the GRE is almost at parity in most business schools with the GMAT. And during the end of last cycle, schools started accepting any test acronym, or some schools are testing literally any test acronym. ACT, SAT, MCAT, LSAT, GRE, you name it. The Chinese exam, I don't remember the name of it, I can't pronounce the name of it. They were accepting it. That was an emergency. It's scaling back now. There still are top MBA programs accepting multiple exams, not just the GMAT, not even just the GMAT or the GRE. Do you see, not necessarily going to that extreme, but law schools beginning to accept the GRE more widely?
I would be surprised if they did that, just because, the LSAT is designed for law school, and it's designed to keep in mind that the practice of law is a profession that is weird and much different from other professions. And so there's no math on the LSAT, although there are mathematical concepts on the LSAT. But, most of what lawyers do is, or at least most of the work that you do in law school and what gets you paid the big bucks if you're a lawyer, is crafting arguments, being critical of arguments, and then crafting strategy, which often, surrounds arguments. And so the LSAT, with the exception of logic games, is dominated by argumentation. And so I would be surprised if law schools became more accepting of other exams just because they're less on point. And I know LSAC, obviously, I don't think they've done a study correlating other exams, but they did do a study this was probably a decade ago now, but they did a study about the correlation between performance on LSAT and performance, I think, measured by first year 1L grades in law school. And performance on the LSAT correlated better with performance in law school than did GPA. And so, the selling point of the LSAT is on point with law school. It may be that law schools ultimately think it's not really that important to be testing argumentation so heavily, but I would be surprised if they just opened up the doors to other exams rather than just kind of like the pilot program that we were talking about with the GRE.
And if I may add to that,
sure, go ahead, Christine.
I was at BU when we implemented the policy about the LSAT and the GRE and decided to accept the GRE. And so we accepted it as a test, and it could be used when making assessments. But my opinion is that because the ABA has a hand in how law schools and the education system, I think they are still very much with the LSAT and behind the LSAT, and have yet to really accept the GRE as a functional test to replace. And so I think that's, I think the fact that there's only about 10% of the ABA approved schools that are accepting the GRE is, as was mentioned earlier, is to afford those applicants who might have pursued a master's and are now looking to law school to not preclude them or add an extra hurdle for them. Or like as Jelena was saying, those that are looking at both options as they pursue their graduate and professional school careers. So I think because ABA, I think because the Law School Admissions Council also is the clearinghouse for all, or most application processes moving forward, I think that, and as Branden mentioned, we use that correlation study, and we use that in the fact that we do use the LSAT as a tool because there is statistical significance. Committees are reliant upon that to make decisions. So I think that while the GRE does open some doors and allow some applicants who might otherwise have applied due to a hurdle, I don't think it's going to be as widely used as like what you were
alternative tests to the business school.
Business school, right? Yeah.
I have no opinion on the question I posed. I do know that when business schools started taking the GRE, before they started taking it, they were all talking about the correlation between GMAT scores and success in business schools during the first year of business school. And somehow nobody's talking about it anymore. And then they were talking about correlations between the GRE and success in business school, which there also were studies done that did correlate. And again, once last spring, when there was no GMAT available, and then it was online, and there were problems with the online version, all that got thrown out. And it was practically any test with an acronym was accepted. So I was surprised at the pace with which these other tests were accepted. But if they were somehow showing whatever the schools wanted, then it was like, okay, I'll adapt. But I was wondering if you see it. You basically also that you don't see that happening in the law school world. And okay, that's fine. Now, there are lots of test prep companies out there. What does LSATMax Prep bring to the marketplace that it previously lacked? Branden, you want to start with that one? Or you let
Sure.
You can start. Whoever wants, you can pick.
Go for it, Branden. You had something to say there.
Yeah, so I think LSATMax, well, let me take a step back. So LSATMax has been a distance learning company since the beginning. And now that we have a pandemic going on, I think people are beginning to understand just how difficult it is to study specifically for the LSAT by yourself. And so LSATMax has experience from way back in constructing, well, here's what I think makes us different, in that we construct an online community of people studying for the LSAT. And we come at it in a couple of different ways. And so I'd like to just share a few of those different ways that we come at it. One is that when you sign up for LSATMax, you get lifetime access. And this, I think, separates us from a lot of the distance learning companies because they'll get you on a monthly plan. And what that monthly plan ignores is that studying for the LSAT is not something that you can do in a couple of days or even a couple of weeks. Instead, you're probably going to spend, if you're starting at the beginning, you're probably going to spend 180 hours, if not more, studying for the LSAT. And so the way that LSATMax works is that we get you into the LSATMax family, we get you into the LSATMax ecosphere, and then we give our students a study calendar that tends to start about 4 months out from the start of the exam. And our students are working their way through the course with people studying for that exam at the same time. And so you work your way through the lessons. All of the lessons have homework and flashcards and other practice and drills associated with them. And with all of the questions, there are message boards where students can interact with each other. They can ask questions about the questions and instructors will answer them. And so you've got interaction in that way as you're studying at home for the exam. We also have regular online office hours where students come in and they're able to, learn with an instructor who's walking them through a particular question type or concept.
When you say come in, do you mean come in virtually?
Oh, yes, come in virtually. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Right.
Nobody comes into the office.
Right. Okay.
But yeah, so, and the kind of last thing that I would say is that we have personalized support for all of our students. And since it's lifetime access, it's personalized support for as long as you are with LSATMax. So, if you get through the course, you are looking to take the LSAT again, then you can come back to us and talk to us and ask us, how do I go about this moving forward in a different way? And we're going to do our best to make sure that you get the kind of help that you need, whether that's connecting you with an instructor, whether that's, walking you through another part of the course. It all depends. But just that kind of understanding that studying for the LSAT is long and is difficult, and that we need to provide you with an atmosphere that is comfortable and supportive however long that takes, I think is what really separates us from the competition.
Okay, great. Jelena, do you have anything to add to it?
Yeah, I mean, Branden has already talked about a lot of the things that I think are important about LSATMax. I will add a couple of things. One of them is that we are, to my knowledge, the only major test prep company that actually provides a free premium course to anyone who qualifies for a waiver from LSAC of the testing fee for the LSAT. So that's something that people have already qualified based on their income, based on their financial need with LSAC. They just send it to us and they can get free access to our premium online course. So that's that self-paced course that Branden is talking about. So, that's really a value that is important to LsatMax. LsatMax is a values-driven company, and unlike a lot of companies in the test prep space, it is also owned by the owner and founder, who's a Harvard-educated lawyer. There's no shady Silicon Valley VC money. There's no hedge fund that owns the company. We make our money off of the money that people pay us for test preparation and tutoring. That's the services that we provide, and the fact that students continue to be happy with those services and continue to refer their friends and new people continue to sign up is how the company continues to operate. So that, as someone who worked in the startup world for a decade and has seen a lot of the negative consequences of being a startup that's funded by venture capital, that's really important to me, because when you are bootstrapping and you're actually operating your company off of the revenue it brings in, you're able to be more values driven. There's nobody else that says, but if you didn't do that, you could have a higher profit. If you, the owner, say, well, but it's within my values to give these free courses to people who have test waivers, and I don't care if that makes my profit lower, then you get to do that. So, we get to do that. And we get to do the Justice in Action program, which is a support program that we just announced for future lawyers who want to bring a little bit more social justice to the world through the practice of law. So you can find out more about that on the LsatMax blog, but we're going to be supporting a whole bunch of amazing future lawyers through their entire journey with free Lsat Prep, free tutoring, free 1L year support, free bar exam prep, job search assistance, basically the whole way. And no other company is really doing anything like that either. So I think you're working with a better company. You're working with values-driven people who want to make a difference in the world.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a great answer. And with that, I want to thank you both, Branden and Jelena, for joining us today. And before I turn the controls over to you, where can Accepted listeners learn more about LsatMax Prep's LSAT and GRE Prep and the Legal Level podcast?
It's a little bit of a tongue twister. I do that when we're recording our podcast intro sometimes too.
You're making me feel better. Thank you.
LsatMax.
LsatMax Prep. Okay.
Yes. So first of all, the Legal Level podcast, which is our podcast, is available on all major listening platforms. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, all of the above. So just type in the Legal Level and you will find us. For LsatMax in general, you can go to lsat-prep.com, and we are ready and eager to answer any of your questions. And if you have questions specifically for us, feel free to email podcast@lsat-prep.com. And if it's a question for us to answer on our podcast, maybe we'll do that. Or if you just want to talk to one of us, we're happy to either talk to you or pass you along to the right person at LsatMax.
Sounds good. All right.
And that's where we leave off for today. Stay tuned to your podcast feed for part 2, where Linda and Christine answer our questions about law school admissions. For instance, do they think law school applications will be spiking along with COVID-19 this year or down like the economy?
Oof. Well, for the answer to that question and more, you'll have to listen to part 2.
In the meantime, you can always check out Admissions Straight Talk for, well, some straight talk about graduate school admissions. We've put a link in the show notes. Until next time, stay hydrated, study hard, and remember, plenty of heroes carry a briefcase.